Told you so. Now let the seething begin. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Jagdpanzer IV L 70 command vehicle. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. The model here is built mostly out of the box. However, during the build, I went ahead and changed out a couple of the kit's features with some aftermarket options. We'll be going over these additions, as well as also going over the standard kit, not to mention giving the model a thorough in-box review. So stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the command variant of the Jagdpanzer IV L 70. The Jagdpanzer IV was a German World War II tank destroyer that was based upon the Panzer IV chassis. Prior to the design of this vehicle over here, the Germans always had the need for a dedicated tank destroyer, or also known as a Panzerjäger. The Panzerjägers that came out before this vehicle here were generally based on tanks that were basically obsolete by this time, where the chassis was good, and so they would remove the superstructure and fit on a high velocity gun. Generally, these vehicles had an open top configuration with a very thin armored casemate type design. Another vehicle that was also being fielded by the Germans at this time was known as the Sturmgeschütz, or the Stug. The Stug was an assault gun and was based on the chassis of the Panzer III. What was unique about the Stug was that it had a casemate design, but it had a very effective main gun. The main gun didn't necessarily have that much velocity to it, but it was really efficient at both taking care of armor threats, as well as also being used to support infantry with rounds that were high explosive. The Stug, though, was really a jack-of-all-trades type of a vehicle, but the need for a dedicated Panzerjäger with sufficient armor protection and an equally high-velocity specialized gun was still deemed to be necessary, and that is where this design came in. Unlike the Stug, the Panzerjäger was going to be more heavily armored. It was going to be based upon the Panzer IV chassis, which by this point here was in full production, and all of the bugs were ironed out, making it for a really reliable and robust platform. On top of that, the main armament for the Panzerjäger was solely designed for armor penetration. And you can see this also with the way the vehicle is configured. The Panzerjäger has a very sleek design, which has a very low profile to it, which makes it ideal for ambushing, as well as also makes it a really difficult target to hit. On top of that, the Panzerjäger was going to use extensive use of sloped armor plates on the front as well as the sides to really give the maximum amount of armor protection that one can possibly have. Because this vehicle is based on the Panzer IV, the drivetrain and the engine were identical to the standard units, as were the remainder of the running gear suspension system. These vehicles entered in production around December of 1943 and continued up until the war's end in April of 1945. A really good number of these units were produced, in total roughly about 2,000. For the main armament, they generally had the 7.5 centimeter PaK 42. However, there were several other armament options that were thought up and configured for this vehicle. What's unique about the Panzerjäger was that this one has a secondary armament, which was something that wasn't really present on the previous Stugs. The secondary armament was uniquely using an MG42. Generally on German tanks, they would have stuck with the MG34T, but for this one, they decided to up it with the 42 for one reason or another. Also, what's really unique about the Panzerjäger is that the MG42 was housed inside of the vehicle and was accessed through a small little rotating hatch that would pivot out of the way, and then it would allow the machine gun to be utilized. This is far different compared to several of the other vehicles of the era, which had a ball machine gun mount where the barrel protrudes from the vehicle. The Jagdpanzer IV L 70 served on both fronts during World War II and was utilized to great effect. Post-World War II, a number of them wound up in Eastern Europe, where they continue to be used as either rear echelon vehicles or possibly even as pillboxes as the vehicles eventually became obsolete and were replaced by newer ones by those countries. And I believe even a few of them wound up in the Middle East. However, the Jagdpanzer IV L70 is actually one of the more common German World War II tank destroyers that are still found today as surviving examples in military museums all over the world. One other thing that's noteworthy about the Jagdpanzer IV L70 was that this vehicle was the inspiration for the West German Kanone that was developed by the Bundeswehr and was utilized from the 1960s through the early 1990s. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1990s vintage Dragon Jagdpanzer IV L70. However, this one's a unique one because this kit here is the command version of this vehicle. This kit here dates back to 1997. Like I often mention in these Dragon vintage kit build videos, the Dragon model company that we know it as today was really just a small upstart company in the early 1990s time period. Because of their small stature, they didn't have a whole lot of resources to invest in their own tooling to create the various kits that they would eventually roll out. Because of their limitations, Dragon decided to go ahead and take a shortcut. And rather than tooling up their own brand new kits for certain items, what they would do is they would go ahead and borrow, or I should say acquire tooling from other kits that were already on the market from other companies. They would take the basic version of a vehicle kit, say a Panzer IV in this instance, and then they would go ahead and tool up different components to add to the base hull, converting it to a different version of the Panzer IV that at that time wasn't on the market. Dragon went ahead and employed this method and it worked. They did it to a large number of kits from their Panzer IV series to their Panther series as well as their Sherman series. Many of which that I mentioned I've actually built and have model showcase videos of these builds that are posted on the ECA channel. This little tactic was actually very successful, and within a short period of time, Dragon amassed a large catalog of items that were consisting of very unique vehicles that, again, were either not made by the other manufacturers, or if they were, the Dragon ones were superior because of the extra parts that were supplied with the Dragon kit. The Dragon kit utilized brand new tooling, which was using new technology of the era, and the kits were superior compared to some of the other renditions on the market, which were considerably dated, being from the 1970s or the 1980s timeframe. Because of the success of these kits, Dragon now had more capital to invest into their kits, improving them further from the original releases that they came out with. This is something that is seen by Dragon. They don't really rest on their laurels, and they basically just rehash and regurgitate vehicles that they've already made, but they would change the tooling on them progressively and improve the detail fidelity as well as the features found on these kits. This is sometimes considered to be a detriment because it can get a little boring at times when a new Dragon release comes out and, oh look, it's another Panzer IV or another Tiger or another Panzer III of one flavor or another. However, this is done just to prevent the kits from getting stagnant in their catalog listings. And that's exactly what we have here. This kit here is a second generation or possibly a third generation release of the Dragon Jagdpanzer IV L70 kit. The previous kits that I just mentioned were all consisting of borrowed Italy tooling, and from the mid-1990s onward, Dragon were going away from using the Italy tooling, but they were making changes to it. And this kit here, you're going to see some of those changes that have been made. The vehicles themselves are all consisting of Dragon tooling. However, the design of the parts and with the way they are molded, some of which you can still see some of the lineage back to the Italy kits that they originally borrowed in order to create their first generation releases. Of course, I'll be able to go more into this information once the model gets opened up and you'll be able to see the kit contents. As for this kit itself, I acquired it off of eBay maybe a year and a half ago, so it hasn't been sitting in the stash for very long. It does have a little bit of shelf dust on it, but that shouldn't be enough to stop me from starting on this kit here. Just like with the other Dragon kits of this era, this kit here is fairly easily come by. They were made in good numbers and had very good distribution. It wouldn't be uncommon to find one of these kits squirreled away at your local hobby shop. You will also be able to find one of these at places like a model show vendor or possibly even a swap meet and even a flea market, depending, of course, the quality of the vendor. This kit, like I said, I acquired off of eBay, and these kits are still relatively affordable. I picked this one up below, I believe, $30, so it was anywhere between 20 to 25 bucks around there. And I'm actually looking really forward to starting this one because I remember seeing this one being plastered in the Squadron catalogs of the era. Starting with the vehicle's box art, this composition here was illustrated by Vince. Vince was a very prolific illustrator that Dragon utilized during this era, and his compositions are very nicely done. Here you can see the Jagdpanzer IV L in the foreground. He did a nice job with the rendering, as well as all the little details that are found on the track and the suspension. The camo pattern is also nicely rendered as well. The rest of the composition is equally as well composed. We have here a German armor column with a couple of German half-tracks. There's a collapsed bridge, and they even have a new bridge assembly that they are erecting. Not to mention a squad of late war German infantry right over here. One nice thing about the composition is that the vehicle is the most colorful thing in the composition, and the background is actually slightly subdued and is arguably even grayscale in certain locations, which brings your eye directly to the foreground with the main vehicle in focus. It's a very nice trick that Vince did incorporate on this illustration. Moving on from the art review takes us to the remainder of the graphic design. Here we have the typical typeface that Dragon would have utilized on their kits of the period. The name of the vehicle in the larger print, and then this, by the way, is a little bit different because this is not part of their 39 to 45 series and is instead part of their Imperial series. The Dragon Imperial series were kits that were, I believe, supposed to be the upper echelon of the kits that they were producing of the era. I would say that it would be using all of their new tooling, however, that's not really true because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, their Panther F kit as well as their HVSS Sherman kit that I've done did recycle several components found on the Italeri kit. So I can't really say it's a rule of thumb, but if anyone knows any further, feel free to mention that in the comments section listed below. In the upper corner here, we have the Dragon logo, as well as some other verbiage down here in this really hard to read blue text, but basically says unassembled plastic model kit and box contains enough contents for one model. Moving towards the bottom portion here, we have a thumbnail of another Dragon kit that's in their lineup, which is their, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that at this time, but it's a command version of the Panther, which I'll be touching upon in another video, but you know, that's coming attractions. Anyway, remainder of the graphic design is as such. We have here some corporate information. Note the year is 1997, as well as some other info found on the side box here. On the side tab, we have a thumbnail of the vehicle. And by the way, for the Imperial series, they use a slightly different color palette compared to what's typically found on the 39 to 45 series. This, of course, is kit number 9043. And on the reverse tab here, we have some other thumbnails of a pre-built example of this model here. And the model does look pretty handsomely built from these snippets. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and crack this one open. This kit here is all comprising of injection molded plastic. I believe there may be a fret or two of some photo etch, as this was something that Dragon was incorporating on their kits of the era, but I'm not really sure about that. It's been a while since I cracked this one open. So anyway, here are all the components. All the parts are made in this dark gray type styrene. This material is what would be found on Dragon kits of the era, and Dragon actually would change the composition of their plastic as time went on. If you look at the plastic that's used on their new tooling kits, it's considerably different compared to the ones found on their older releases. Looking up closer, you can see the quality of the detailing found on these parts here. Although the kit's tooling is considerably older compared to what we expect to see today, the tooling quality did hold up very well with age, in my opinion. You can see the row wheels, the details are nice and crisp. And moving up takes us most importantly to the suspension cluster. Now this is all 100% Dragon tooling. On the older releases, this piece here would have been recycled from the Italeri kits. The Italeri Panzer IV family would have had a semi-functional suspension where the piece would have been able to rock and pivot, but on this one here, Dragon took those parts and just made them as one complete cluster. The pieces themselves visually are very similar to the ones found on the Italeri kit, but as you can see, Dragon was really starting to make the kits more their own. From the swing arm clusters, you can see the steel-rimmed row wheels. This is purely Dragon tooling. I don't believe Italeri ever made these parts specifically at that time. And below here we have the hubcaps, as well as the bump stops. And note the detailing found on these pieces here. Even to today's standards, these parts are very nicely detailed. On the other side of the runner, you can see some of the other new tooling Dragon parts, namely the sprockets, final drive, and the either wheel. Next up is the lower hull. This piece here would have been Italeri tooling on some of the earlier generations of the Dragon kits, but on this one here, you can see how it's been Dragonified, so to speak. All of the lower hull accoutrements are present, which would include the rivets, the escape hatch, axis panels, all of the litany of details which one would expect on the bottom of this vehicle. Dragon went ahead and added them. On the side portion here, you can see little drawings that were molded in that tell you exactly what details go where, which is a nice feature, and I believe is still one that is seen on a large number of their kits. Carrying on takes this runner. This one here is a Jagdpanzer L70 specific runner, where we have the front plate. Note the detailing on here. You have the torch cut lines found on the puzzle sections of the armor plate, as well as you also have what's unique for this kit, the ability to have the armored cone here either in the close or open position. We have here the roof, as well as the main gun mounting trunnion, travel lock, and of course even the barrel itself. On this kit here, the barrel is a two-part assembly, which again is very typically found on plastic tank model kits. Of course, a little bit of body work is going to be required to assemble this, but more information on that is to come. Carrying on takes us to this runner. This is a straight up Panzer IV, nope, I'm sorry, it's a Jagdpanzer specific runner. And we have some parts to the engine deck, as well as the tools and the other bits of details which are found on this pattern of vehicle. Note on the jack block, they went ahead and did a nice job with molding in the wood grain for this little section over here. And the other details, again, hold up for even with the age of this kit. One nice feature is even on the inside portion here of the grille, you can see some of the inner details. That's a nice touch. And wasn't found on some of the earlier renditions of the Dragon Panzer IV kits. This runner here is the front bow as well as the rear armor plate. The Jagdpanzer IV is really cool because it has that knife blade on the front of it. It's one of the key things that make it different compared to your standard garden variety Panzer IV. And this piece here really converts the standard Panzer IV hull, which is supplied with the kit, into one of the Jagdpanzer L70. This feature is done on many other kits around the market, but that's really a topic for another day. And of course, this runner here is, well, the remainder of the kit. We have here the component for the upper hull. Hopefully come into focus with this cellophane not being too obtrusive, but you can see some of the details that are molded into the front plate here, namely to get access to the transmission. The diamond plate found on the tin work, as well as some of the other fixins that are present on this section here. Oh, here we have the mantlet. One thing that was really cool about Dragon kits was that they had some good cast texturing found on these pieces, or on the appropriate pieces, and this gun mantlet here is no exception. The piece is very nicely molded, and is something that, honestly, you really don't need to add anything to it, but we'll see how that pans out once it gets a coat of paint or two. All in all, it looks like this kit here is very well engineered, and it should be for a very enjoyable build. The next runner is this one, which is obviously the command equipment. We have here the umbrella type antenna. And I like the way they have to mold it into this little ring over here just to protect it. And by the way, this is something that even I myself had to design when I was developing the 1/16 scale, comparing to this that I built on a Command Tiger one that I did a little while ago, but I feel your pain. Here we have the other antenna components which are required in order to convert the standard L70 to the Command version. And this is something that I'm equally looking forward to assembling. And then that takes us to the next portion, which is this runner that we have here. Being a Dragon tank kit of the 1990s timeframe, this kit utilizes individual Lincoln length tracks for the track assembly method, which was something that was a hallmark on Dragon tank kits from basically day one until very recently when Dragon themselves came to the conclusion that, oh yeah, these tracks suck and everyone hates them. And by the way, for the longest period of time, these tracks here were a complete nuisance and stopped individuals from purchasing their kits. And which was, of course, a real shame because the Dragon tank kits were fantastic. You know, they had some excellent details on them. The subject matters were very unique, and they just build into very nice builds until you get to the tracks, and these things just prove to be impossible to put together, and they look like crap. So I'm not even going to dignify them with a review. Instead, I will be replacing them with a set of single-piece vinyl tracks. These tracks here are from Italeri, and wait, oh, did you hear that? I just did. I just heard the unanimous groan and seethe from a number of tank building modeling elitists. And by the way, that groan and seethe is very refreshing and enjoyable to me. This set here I picked up off of eBay back in 2002 for really the reasons that we see here to upgrade a Dragon Panzer IV that I had on hand at the time. Anyway, these tracks actually made an appearance in an earlier video, which was the 1/35 scale Dragon Dicker Max kit. And in that video, I mentioned I was going to utilize these tracks for that build, but I decided not to. Instead, I went with a set of metal links from Frulli model. The workable tracks were used on that build, not because these tracks are poor quality or anything. In fact, that's quite the contrary. These tracks here were not used because with the type of chassis that was used on the Dicker Max, it used the thinner pattern of Panzer IV type track, so this one here wasn't going to time well with the Dragon sprocket. So after that build, these tracks here went back into storage and I basically shelved them for a build at a future date, which is, well, this one that we have here. For some reason, by the way, the Italeri tracks have this real raw stigma to them. There's a lot of negative connotation out there if you ask on the modeling forums. And of course, the elitists like to poo-poo them, but they unironically like individual track links, so they are literal idiots. Anyway, the tracks themselves are adequately made. And by the way, I believe the problem with the Italeri tracks really comes from misunderstanding them. You see, Italeri tracks really have two types of versions to them. You have the stiffer one and the more flexible type. The stiffer tracks tend to be found on vehicles like their Sherman series, while on their Panther or even their Panzer IV series, they are much more flexible and are more akin to Tamiya type tracks as opposed to the ones found on the other kit that I just mentioned. The quality on the Italeri Panzer IV tracks are nicely molded. If I zoom in here and hopefully get into focus, you can see the thread pattern, which is more than adequate for the job at hand. And on the inside here, we have some nice inner hinge detailing, as well as the guide horn detailing. What's also really interesting, or really convenient, I should say, is that because the Dragon kit here is really based and is built upon Italeri tooling, the tracks here should conform perfectly with the suspension and the sprocket found on this kit. But more information on that, of course, is to follow. Moving on from the controversial tracks for the time being takes us to the decal sheet. The kit does supply with a set of water slide decals, and they consist of the markings that we have here. These decals are printed in Japan, which was the case of the Dragon kits of this era. And one thing I gotta point out is that these decals are usually very good quality. I've built several of these vintage Dragon kits before, and the decals were something that never gave me any problems. Something about these decals, they just age very well. You compare that with something like from Eshi, where even though the kits are somewhat similar in age, the decals just don't hold up on some of those Eschi kits. Compared to the Dragon kits, these decals here are probably going to go on as good as they did, well, when the things were first printed. So that is actually one nice hallmark found on these older Dragon kits. Finally, this takes us to the instruction sheet. Now, by the way, this kit does not have any sort of photo etch, so, that's quite interesting. Another thing I want to point out is how refreshing it is to build a Dragon kit where you're going to be utilizing most of the kit supply components. You compare that with Dragon kits of the modern era where you have a ton of runners that are supplied, and some of them are just completely blued out, with parts you're not going to use, with maybe like one or two small little pieces that are required for the build. For this one here, that's not the case, and honestly, that is a bit refreshing, but I guess this is a kit from another era. Opening up the instruction sheet, you can see some of the layout. This is old school with the drafting. This is not CAD drawings like what we see on current generation of kits. And you are going to need to make some slight modifications to the model in order to convert it to a Jagdpanzer, like namely deletion of some of these parts here and here. But again, this appears to be very well illustrated and laid out, and I'm pretty sure should go together very well. But of course, if there are any mistakes or misprints found on the instructions, I'll be sure to point that out as the video progresses. During the model's construction, I had a little snag with the exhaust manifold system. Here we have the kit components for the exhaust manifold. Of course, there would be two of these pieces that are identical to each other and would be supplied with the kit. The kit consists of 4 components in whole. We have 2 components that form the bottom portion as well as the main internal exhaust port. And then we have 2 more sections that glue together to form the coolant tube that you see here. The pieces themselves assemble pretty well out of the box, and when done will give you the basic representation of the exhaust manifold. Well then, if that's the case, why is it that I had a small little snag with this part? Well, that's not really to do with the actual quality of the parts themselves. It has to do when I was actually building the model. One of the bottom bases here went off the Lost Partia, and the piece was completely lost. I tried looking for it, but eventually I gave up. After sulking for a little bit, I went ahead to see if I could track down some aftermarket sources. After doing a little bit of Googling, I found that when it comes to replacement Panzer IV Alf J or lay pattern exhaust manifolds, specifically 1/35 scale, surprisingly, there's really not a whole lot of options out there. There's this one set which consists of a mix of resin components as well as photo etch pieces, and the pieces actually look very nice. However, I really don't have the time to bend and solder and get the PE properly bent to form the shape and get the whole piece really assembled. I then saw another set which was made out of all cast resin, which looked to be the part, and it was awesome. However, it was 1/48 scale, which means, well,
you're shit out of luck.
So after seeing the rather limited selection that was available, I decided, you know what, I might as well go ahead and make one myself. And only my material isn't going to be cast resin or photo etch, it's going to be 3D print. And that led up to the components that we see right here on the table. We're going to temporarily move these ones out of the way so we can get a better view of these new replacement units. Here go the new late pattern 1/35 scale Panzer IV exhaust manifold set. Unlike the other sets that I mentioned before, which are a mix of cast resin and photo etch, these components here are made entirely of 3D print. It is one entire printing, and the material is the HD material that have been seen on several of the other 3D prints that I've discussed and shown on this channel in the past. What's different about this set as opposed to the other ones that I just mentioned, outside of the material choice, is that unlike those other ones, which are a mosaic set and you need to assemble the piece in a couple sub-assemblies prior to final installation, these pieces here are integrally printed as one unit. Because of that, no other sub-assembly work is required. You simply snip off the sprue and mount them to your model. With the piece being held by a tweezer, you should be able to get a better view of it without my knuckles clogging up the view. And if the thing can get to focus. Okay, on the bottom portion here of the guard itself, you can see that there's a giant hole on the bottom. This is present on the real unit, but it's absent on the stock Dragon piece. In addition to the air inlet hole, you can see the actual exhaust manifold itself. On the Panzer IV family, with this pattern of exhaust manifolds, the tube that I'm actually holding onto, that's your exhaust manifold and connects to the engine. The exhaust runs through here and then makes its way out via that same small little tube. The remainder of the jacket that we see here is primarily used for cooling, just like what was similarly seen on the Tiger 1, where it had that nice elaborate air vent that's found on the inside. On the Panzer IV, they went ahead and employed a system which is similar to what's found on late pattern Panthers, where you had that giant tube in the back with that really cool fan system, or it looks like a fan system found on the top. On the Panzer IV here, the way this would work was air would be sucked in through the hole via the exhaust puffing away on the top. Notice the exhaust hole itself is sunk into the tube so that when the air is being blown out, it causes an updraft. Cool air from the environment gets drawn in from this large hole that we have on the bottom and makes its way through the tube, thus cooling down the exhaust manifold system. On the inside portion here, you can see that the little tube is supported by 4 little blades, and they basically keep the tube centered in the system, and the cooling shroud just wraps around it. The cooling shroud itself connects to the bottom base, and this bottom base is bolted to the tank via this tiny little flange that we have here on the rear. On the model here, it has the fastener detailing already integrally printed on. One other thing to mention, which may be difficult to get on camera at this point, but on the center spine here of the tube, it's where the 2 sections of metal would overlap and are crimped together. It forms this distinctive little line that runs from the top to the bottom portion of this tube. This is another bit of detailing that's integrally printed on this component, and is one that is going to be more appreciated after the model is fully painted. Because these parts here are 1/35 scale, they are not posted on the standard ECA catalog. Instead, these parts are listed on my ECA Shapeway store, and the link is found in the video description below. On the Shapeway store, I have a multitude of other detail components for other models in both 1/35 scale, as well as also in other scales like 1/48. For the installation, obviously this is extremely simple. All you have to do is just swap out the kit supply parts with the ECA ones. Although, you'll notice that on the stock component here, the holes are slightly smaller compared to the stem, or I should say the exhaust manifold section, found on the ECA printing. In order to get the piece to fit on, with a 1.5mm micro bit and a pin vise, just enlarge the holes until the pieces will fit directly in place. Obviously, you don't have to use a pin vise. A Dremel will do the task equally as well. And here go the exhausts now fitted to the vehicle. You can see that from the top portion there's a small little gap between the rear of the wall and the guard box itself. And this is by design and is as per the real vehicle. This is why on the bottom portion of the guard box there's those little bracket with those 2 fasteners on it, because this is actually how the unit would be affixed to the vehicle. Starting with the model's running gear and lower hull, all of the components that you see on the model sans the track are the original kit supply parts and went on really without any problems. I found the suspension components to be very nicely detailed, and they assembled very easily and pretty much effortlessly. One thing that I do want to point out though is that when you're working on one of these models, you have to pay attention to the mods that are required to be made to the lower hull. Because Dragon recycles this lower hull on a number of different Panzer IV based vehicles, some of them may require you to drill or remove certain aspects that are found on the model in order to custom tailor it for the rendition that you're working on. This one here had some sections that were integrally molded in as suggestion points for other suspension features which would have been used again on other renditions of the Panzer IV base model. So with this one here, the ones that are not utilized, you need to promptly eliminate, and this is quickly done with a little bit of sandpaper. If memory serves, I believe there was also a small little hole found in the top portion over here that needs to have been plugged up and deleted in order to properly render it for this pattern of the Panzer IV family of tank. Another thing I do want to point out involves the front portion here of the extra armor. Because of the extra panels that get fitted to this section, you are going to have some seams to contend with where the extra panels make contact with the standard side hull of the vehicle. This is something that's very easily taken care of with a little bit of red putty and some super glue, plus of course some sandpaper was all that was required to polish it down to a nice seamless appearance. Fortunately, with its location, it's not really one that's extremely visible, so if you do not go ahead and go through the extra steps with the bodywork, you're really not going to notice it. But it's one of those things that's best taken care of while you're working on the model. On the wheels themselves, like I stated before, they are a multi-piece assembly, but once assembled, in my opinion, give some very fantastic results and really do look very well, specifically considering the age of the tooling. One thing that's really cool about this kit is that you do have lots of road wheels available, so you can custom outfit the model to either have all of the rubber rimmed wheels, a few of the steel rimmed wheels, or you could even do a little bit more of a mix and match. One thing that always puzzled me about these German tanks, however, is that when the Germans incorporated the steel wheels on the Panzer IV based vehicles as a cost-cutting procedure, they seem to have been really systematic on where they place their road wheels. Coming off of vehicles like the Sherman or the T-34, where you have different patterns of wheels and they just get randomly intermixed anywhere along the suspension set, the Germans were a little bit more, shall we say, systematic on their wheel placement, and it's not uncommon, or I should say, I've typically seen vehicles that when they put the different pattern wheels, they tend to lump them up right here in the front. Anywhere between 2 to even 4 wheels sometimes lined up in a row is how you generally see them. I'm pretty sure in the field perhaps they may have intermixed them, you know, if there was a repair or two, but generally from what I've seen with these German tanks, they tend to keep all of these different type of road wheels separate and isolated with one another. Same is also true for the wheels on the opposite side. I guess it's one of those German things, I guess, because it is important to point out that there was a line of, or I should say a batch of Panthers that were made towards the end of the war, where all of the wheels were rubber, except for the very last road wheel where they used a steel wheel for one reason or another. So again, if anyone does know, feel free to put that in the comments section below, but basically I guess I'll just chalk that up to just Germans being German, I suppose. On the road wheels, I went with my typical format and how they are painted, where the rubber-rimmed versions have their tires painted with rubber black to replicate the look and feel of rubber, while the steel-rimmed wheels have a little brushstroke of silver on there just to give it that worn look. Keep in mind, these areas here would rub off with paint very, very quickly after a number of rotations while rolling on the all-steel track. Same is also true, by the way, for the return rollers. These were always steel except for some of the very early versions of the Panzer IV where they had a rubber tire on them. It's really difficult to mix the two up, but it is something that I do want to point out. Towards the rear section here, we have the idler wheel, and the idler is all steel on the Panzer IV family vehicle, and that was the case for all variants. There were 2 patterns of rear idlers. This is the earlier pattern. The later pattern had more of a squared off face to it. Regardless of their geometry, both patterns of wheels were steel rimmed. And just like with the other wheels, because this is a fully steel rimmed wheel, the faces of the rims themselves were painted with the same paint that was used on the other wheels that I just mentioned. And of course, it wouldn't be an ECA video unless I pointed this out, but the center portion of all the hubs here, there is a small little Zerk fitting that's used in order to get access to the bearing so you can lubricate the center axles. On all the German tanks, they tend to have these painted in red, and this was something that I've done on many of my builds, this one included, for the same reasons that I've mentioned. Also, again, it's a really, really simple way to improve the look of your build by just adding a small little drop of paint to these sections. The detailing is integrally molded into the model, and just with a small little brush stroke, it's a great way to add that little bit of extra detailing to your build with literally no real extra work required. Moving along takes us to the tank's tracks, and like I stated before, there was no way in hell I was going to keep the individual Lincoln length that were supplied with the kit, and I swapped them out with a pair of single vinyl tracks from Italeri. The Italeri tracks went on with no problems whatsoever. As you can see, the tracks look absolutely perfect on this build. They timed perfectly with the sprocket, the length was ideal, and basically the tracks were a complete problem-free installation. The sprockets on some of the other Panzer IV and Panzer III pattern of vehicles I've worked on from Dragon typically need to have small little modification made to them because of the way the final drives were designed, but on this particular example here, that wasn't the case. The final drives have a nice sturdy axle protruding out of them, so the sprocket slips into this area and it holds onto it very, very nicely, even with the track tension applied. As I also stated earlier on in the video, these Italeri tracks have a bum rap around the modeling community for one reason or another, but as you can see, that's not really the case for all of their tracks. Their Panzer IV tracks were always very nicely rendered, and again, they go on without any problems. The caveat is how you paint them. If you've seen a few of my other videos, I tend to mention that I don't use rattle can spray paint to paint my vinyl tracks because this can lead to issues as the model eventually ages. For this track over here, I airbrushed it with some Tamiya flat black, and then I went ahead and weathered it to the condition with some dry brushing. And although currently on the market, there are lots of really good alternatives to the stock Lincoln Link tracks that are in a workable nature. Such examples would be Frulee, Model Casson, and one of the newest comers would be Rye-fueled models. And although all of those mentioned track options are excellent, and I have used them and will be using them on other builds in the future, these Italeri single-piece tracks here are definitely not something to discount. They work absolutely perfectly, and given the chance, I would definitely use them again. From the tracks takes it to the bow section. Now, like I touched upon before, with the way the piece is designed, it is a multi-component assembly, and once assembled, you do have some seam work to contend with where it makes contact with the hull. Outside of that, you will have a couple seams to deal with where the sections all intersect. Fortunately, the fit on these pieces were really good, I found, and the only thing that was needed to perfect it a little bit further was just a small little drop of super glue on the areas where the two sections met, and then this was just polished down with some fine sandpaper. Once this was done, it leaves for a seamless appearance that we have here. And of course, while on the front hull, the biggest thing to mention is the travel lock. The travel lock is one of the more iconic fittings that are found on this pattern of vehicle, and the Dragon kit variant is very nicely rendered. One really interesting attribute that this kit has is that if you take your time and you're really careful on how you apply the glues, this piece here can be made to be fully functional. As you can see, I could swing the piece directly upward, and I can display the model with the gun stowed in this position. Without any sort of tools required, I could just simply move the barrel and hinge the piece back down to its active state. Now, the piece is assembled in a three-piece assembly where we have the main travel lock itself, and then you have these two small little hinges that get glued on either side. These pieces are very finely molded, and you do have to take your time when assembling them. Not only do you have to take your time, but if you use a little bit too much glue, the piece will just solidify in a closed or an open state. But most importantly, these small little pieces are so frail that they can easily fling off to Lost Party on. If they do, your piece is basically screwed. So this is one of those parts of the build where you really want to take your time and basically move in a slow, methodical manner during the part removal from the sprue, as well as also the installation. If you do that and you're lucky, the piece should be fully functional like the way I was able to achieve on this model here. Hopping to the rear of the vehicle first takes us to the exhaust manifolds. Here you can see the new ECA 3D printed components mounted on the model, and they are fully painted and weathered. As I showed before, the pieces are very thoroughly detailed. It's hard to see in this lighting over here, but now that they are fully painted and weathered, you get a good idea on what they look like in their completed format. And for good measure, hopefully the weathering on the bottom portions comes out on video. As for the paintwork, this was done in my typical format, and the 3D printed material had absolutely no problems taking on the layers of paint, as well as also the weathering techniques that I use for this application, which is the use of the Sophisticated Finishes rust applicator, where it's a two-piece type system where you brush on the basically iron filing paint, then you throw on the catalyst chemical, which will give you the rusty appearance that you see here, which is actually, well, real rust. Of course, the black soot is airbrushed on after the rust does its thing, but it's one of those things that it had absolutely no effect on the material itself. This is something interesting to point out because on other builds that I've done in the past where I've utilized the HD material, they are paint dependent, where if you use something like an enamel-based paint on the surface, it will tend to have some negative results as the model ages. So far, with this model here being several months old, I haven't seen that problem arise, and this is also true for many of the other builds, basically all the builds so far that I've mentioned on this channel that I've used components printed with this medium. Outside of the exhaust manifolds, the remainder of the equipment is stock with the exception of the row here of spare track. These are the ones that are found on the Italeri runner, and they were basically assembled and mounted to the rear rack that we have here. Of course, the Italeri track just drops directly onto the kit supplied spare track rack with zero problems whatsoever. The remainder of the stock details would include the jack block, the convoy light, as well as also the reflector that's integrally molded on. On these two components here, in order to really make them pop from the model, all you gotta do is simply paint them. The rear reflector here is painted with a small little drop of gloss red, while the No-Tech tubular convoy light here is painted with a little swipe of gloss blue. Moving towards the side of the model takes to the side skirt hookups. This kit does not supply you with the components for this side skirt, but the hookups are present and are really, really nicely done out of the box. This is actually one of my favorite aspects of this kit, is exactly how nicely detailed these pieces are. They go on without any problems, and once installed, they really do look good. The one thing though that as the builder you really need to pay attention to is when you're installing them, you want to make sure that they are mounted in a very straight manner, and these pieces here will have a habit on shifting on you after the piece is mounted and while the glues are still setting. So again, it's one of those pieces where you want to take your time with the alignment, and once the pieces are aligned properly, the installation goes by really smooth. Another thing to watch out with these pieces, and this is true for basically all these Jagdpanzer L70s, is with their location and their shape, they are really, really, really snag prone, and it's not uncommon to be handling one of these models and you might actually snag one and break it off the model. So when handling a Jagdpanzer L70, this is one thing you really want to pay attention to. Moving up takes to the rear engine deck, and this is one area of the build that you will have to be making several modifications to that are kit recommended. As would have seen on several other Dragon Panzer III and Panzer IV base vehicles, since they reuse the molds for several other renditions of the same vehicle, just like with the lower hull, you will have to custom modify some areas of the build for your specific build. With this one over here, there are several indication points that need to be drilled out by the builder in order to successfully mount on all of the tools in their appropriate locations. Fortunately, these are all very well illustrated on the instructions and are equally very well labeled on the model's tooling itself. But you do have to be careful when you're drilling these out, because if you're just going through the motions, you can accidentally make holes in areas where they are not necessary. Again, pay attention to the instructions, double check, and then drill once. For the drill, I utilize my pin vise. I don't recommend a Dremel for this application because a Dremel, even at its slowest speeds with a fine bit, will still make the holes larger than they really need to be. A pin vise with the appropriate size bit will be able to drill right through the material without any problems, and it won't cause any collateral damage. As for the bits, I recommend picking them up from my vendor that I have listed below, which is found also in the video description. As for a pin vise, well, you can pick up one from basically any online retailer. Amazon.com has several good examples, and so does AliExpress. One difference on this particular example, which differs it from the others made by Dragon, is with the rear antenna base mount. Because this is the command variant, you do have the extra components to add to it in order to build in this configuration. Fortunately, again, all of the provisions for mounting on this equipment is well illustrated in the instructions, as well as also on the kit's tooling. For the bottom base here of the umbrella antenna base, you can see it has its armored collar, and you can also see the insulator molded in below the rubber portion of the insulator. On the model here, or I should say on the real German vehicles with this type of antenna-based system, the porcelain section is actually a white glossy porcelain, and then the top portion would be a rubber insulator. On the model here, in order to really make it pop, you carefully paint that section with some gloss white, and then the middle point here you would paint with the rubber black. Just like I also mentioned in these videos, on the portion that emits from the insulator would actually be a brass fitting, and again, fortunately Dragon molds all these nice details in, and all you gotta do is properly paint them. So again, just like I frequently mentioned, this portion here was painted with a little swipe of brass paint, and this was able to achieve the look that you see here. On the antenna base on the opposite side, the same thing was also done, but obviously this one does not have that big porcelain insulator found on the bottom portion. Also, I believe that this kit either had the antenna molded in, or I believe it was just a small little stub that was integrally molded into the plastic. Well, for my model, I wanted to have it with the antenna wire present, but if you're going to do that, you're going to have to amputate the molded in stub. The stub is so finely molded that trying to drill it out and put in a piece of metal wire is problematic, if not impossible. So on this one here, like I frequently do, I amputate off that little molded in stub. I drill the piece out with a pin vise, install the piece of wire, and then it's all remaining with the way it's painted. The wire itself is painted in black, but the bottom portion here is painted with the gold or brass paint like I touched upon before for the exact same reason. This technique is one that I've used on basically all of my smaller scale German vehicles, and it's one that does work out really, really well, and again, it gives you that nice extra pop on your model. On that note, a common thing that is overlooked on a lot of the models that I see on YouTube, and again, some of them are actually really nicely built and painted, but it's one thing that people tend to forget about are the cleaning staves. The cleaning staves on these German tanks were made from wooden rods, and they have brass fittings on the end. Well, again, all of this is basically molded in. In order to highlight it, it all comes down to the way everything is painted. The rods are painted with the wood coloring, and then the end connectors are just painted with a simple swipe of gold or brass paint. This is really all you gotta do on all these German vehicles in order to really get the piece to where it needs to be. And again, it doesn't really take that much extra work. This is true not just for this Jagdpanzer here, but the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, you name it. If it has exposed, well, not so much the Panther, but if it has exposed cleaning staves, this is a simple way to really make your model polished compared to leaving it, just overpainted. And most people just leave it, flat black or something. Or worse, they try to weather it to make it look like metal rods, which is just not the case. On the end portion over here, we have the cleaning swab, and the swab on these vehicles here had a canvas cover on them, protecting the bristles from getting damaged. The canvas material was that German green or sometimes gray, Feldgrau type coloring, and this is what was used to protect everything. For this model here, I went with the green approach, but you could easily use a Dunkelgelb or a Feldgrau color for the same effect. As for which one works best for you, well, that's really up to your discretion. Moving forward takes us to the roof of the vehicle, and there's not really a whole lot going on up here. The Jagdpanzer IV was a very minimalistic vehicle in terms of top roof detailing. But there are a couple things I want to touch upon, so let me bring the camera in closer so you get a better look. Starting with the periscopes, this vehicle does have 3 periscopes that are present on this location. There are 2 on the sides and the main gunner's optic found on the front. One thing about the periscopes on these German vehicles, well, first on the kit here, they are very nicely rendered. But one thing to keep in mind is how they are painted. On the German vehicles, the periscopes would have been encased in a Bakelite housing, and generally the Bakelite could be either red or black in coloring. For my models, I like to paint them with the red because it gives the model, again, a little bit extra color and pop. The lens itself on the center, of course, would be a prism, and on the model here, I always replicate my prisms with being painted in gloss black. For painting the Bakelite, you could use either Tamiya Hull Red or Tamiya Flat Brown. Either color will basically get you a good representation of the Bakelite material. For the gunner's optic here on the front, this here is, again, a nicely rendered piece from Dragon, and I went ahead and painted it with the gloss black coloring that you see here. Moving back to the front of the vehicle takes us to the main armament, and the vehicle's components are very, very nicely rendered. The way you see it on this model here is completely stock out of the box with no mods being made. The mantlet is exquisitely rendered, where it has some really nice cast texturing found on the piece, as is the main rotor section that we have right here. That includes the rigidity braces that are integrally molded on, as well as the other detailing such as the rotor equipment that would be found on the top portion. Note the cap there with the 3 fasteners. One thing that's really nice about the kit is that the piece is full function in that it can pivot side to side as well as up and down, and it could also go in any angle in between. The way you see the piece here is built stock, again, out of the box. As for the main tube itself, the kit supplies you with 2 options for the armament. One's a slightly shorter variant, and this one here is the longer version that was found on the box art. Obviously, I went with the box art variant, and again, very nicely rendered. The piece is a two-part barrel assembly, which again is quite standard and what we typically see on these models, and so the seam work was simply contended with, leaving for the nice smooth appearance that we have here. One thing that's really cool is that on the edge portion we have a thread protector, again integrally molded on, and overall the piece is very nicely detailed. From the gun takes to the remainder of the front sections, and this vehicle here does have some seam work to contend with, basically on where the front plate here makes contact with the sides. You are going to have a little bit of seam work in this little area, but just like with the front section, was easily addressed with a little bit of super glue and some hand sanding. While on the front, it also takes us to the bow section right over here, where you have an option to have the unit fully closed up or in the open configuration. It was a nice touch with the way the kit was designed, and obviously for this one here, I rendered it in the open position. Periodically, let's bounce back to the rear, specifically focusing on the rear command antenna base. This is something that I kind of went against my better judgment with going with, and so far it seems like it's working okay. Basically, the antenna base consists of three components. I already touched upon the bottom portion earlier, but here you can see the plastic stem for the antenna, and then the umbrella portion, which is right over here. All three of these pieces are nicely rendered and are pretty crisply molded. However, one reservation that I always had with my models is that I don't like plastic antennas. The reason why is that they may look okay for now, but they just have a really, really bad habit on getting snagged. And when they snag, they snap. And when they snap, you can't fix them. They are almost impossible to repair and repair cleanly. This is why on all of my models on this channel that typically have plastic antennas like this, the first thing I do is I amputate them and I replace them with a metal wire. The metal is great because if it bends, you simply just bend it back to shape and you're good to go. For this one here, like I stated, I went against my better judgment and rolled with the kit one, and so far it seems to be holding up quite well. From here, or I should say once this video is done filming, I'm going to be taking this model, putting it in my little dust-proof plastic box, and then from there it should be safe for time to come, preventing it from getting damaged. But something like this, you could just tell is just, very easily just snagged and broken. The other thing, too, is that possibly if/when the model ages, the antenna wire can possibly warp or bend just due to the plastic aging, and this may be something that can be a problem as the months and years roll on. But so far, knock on wood, it seems like it's okay and it's holding up pretty well. Again, if this takes a turn for the worse, I'll make an update video on this where I replace it with a metal wire. This is something that's not hard to do. I simply just amputate the section, drill it out, and replace. The trick is with the umbrella portion, but again, with the pin vise and with a small micro bit, it should make short work of drilling this area out so that I can get the piece fitted in place. Also, in case anyone is wondering, there are aftermarket options out there that are made in photo etch and are way more resilient compared to the plastic one that is supplied with the kit. But having said that, the kit one's actually pretty good, and you can build it out of the box with it without there being really any problems. Carrying on takes us to the camouflage and the markings. For the model's paint scheme, I went with a German three-tone camouflage pattern, much along the lines as we saw on the side tab of the box during the unboxing portion. The camo is done with my usual colors and my usual application technique with the use of a double-action airbrush, and the weathering is also done, part and parcel as we see on several of the other builds that are found on this channel. That would include the use of both an airbrush, washing, and also dry brushing. The decals are the kit supply ones, and they are your typical water slide decal quality. They went out without any problems, and they also varnished on pretty well and flat. It's just that on this particular example over here, for some reason, if the model is in the light in a certain way, they tend to shine a little bit more compared to some of the other builds that I've built from Dragon, and this also includes their older builds. But by and large, the water slide decals on this one were pretty good. Overall, I'm pretty happy in how this one turned out. This was another one of those kits that was around in my youth and was one of those models I always wanted to add to my collection. Well, finally getting the experience to get one of these kits, build it up to the condition that we have here, and add it to my collection, it's now something I could cross off of my to-do list. Bouncing us into skill level and recommendations, this model here I can't really recommend to a beginner. First, with the stock individual track links, this is an absolute no-go, but then again, I wouldn't recommend those tracks for anybody, let alone for someone who's a beginner. The model itself does go together fairly easily, but again, this is not necessarily the type of thing that's going to be beginner friendly. This is something that, would be good to get into after you have a couple other builds under your belt. So, just like with many of the other builds on this channel, this kit here is really more or less intended for an intermediate to an advanced range. Of course, I can't stress enough the need to replace the stock individual link and link track with some kind of an aftermarket counterpart. Be it a single piece vinyl track like I use on this one over here, or any of the other workable track links on the market. Any of those other things I just mentioned would be a huge benefit to adding to this model. Not only does it actually make the model buildable, but the quality that you'll get from this model here will be vastly superior compared to trying to tackle with the out-of-the-box tracks. Although, of course, with the addition of those parts, the build is going to raise with its overall budget. So if you're the type of person that's thinking about getting into a Jagdpanzer build but are budget conscious, or you just want to build with what's in the box, then this kit here really isn't going to be for you. If, however, you're looking to spend just a little bit more money on the build, well then I can recommend the addition of some of the more affordable track options that are on the market. Like for instance, the sets from Rifle models come to mind, where those retail for a little bit under $20 US. That is something that would be a complete mandatory bit of equipment, in my opinion, in order to build one of these builds. Now, does the base starter kit warrant, or is it worth the addition of the extra cost for those tracks? In my opinion, absolutely. The kit here, even though it is as old as it is, the quality of the tooling has aged remarkably well. This model here has exquisite surface detailing on all of the locations found on the exterior, even on the underhull, and because of that, this kit here, in my opinion, is still just as viable today as it was when these kits first came out all those years ago. And I guess we just shuffled into recommendations. This model here is recommended for anyone who's a fan of the World War II German Zoo. If you're the type of person that digs the tiger, panther, elephant, Jagdtiger, any of those type of vehicles, this kit here would fit into your collection without any problems. I would also highly recommend this kit for anyone who's a die-hard Panzer IV fan. You know who you are. If you're the guy that has the Wirbelwein, the Stug 4, the Panzer IV, the Panzer IV Alpha A, B, C, D, J, what have you, this is another nice addition to add to your collection to fill that little niche that would be remaining with the Jagdpanzer family tree. And that also takes us to another person who would dig this vehicle, anyone who's a fan of German World War II assault guns and or tank destroyers. I need not say any more. Of course, German World War II collectors are not exclusively the only people I would recommend this kit to. Anyone who's a fan of just World War II armor in general, or just if you're just a die-hard threadhead like yours truly, this kit here, again, it's one that would be a nice addition to keep in your collection. Although these kits have not been in production for many years, and they are as old as they are, they tend to still be found fairly common and easily on places like eBay, swap meets, and maybe you might find one tucked away in your local hobby shop. When found, these models are also fairly affordable. Anywhere between 15 to about, 20 to 35 US is generally what you'll encounter them with. And if you do encounter one of these for a really good low price tag, perhaps it's not something that you can overlook. Don't let the age of the model or the low price dissuade you from purchasing this kit, because looks can be deceiving. As like I stated before, these kits are really nicely done for what they are. I would also recommend this kit for anyone who doesn't just want to work with an out-of-the-box offering. These kits here are highly adaptable and you can customize them to basically no end. One benefit about the Panzer IV or the Jagdpanzer base vehicle, specifically 135, is the humongous back catalog there is for detail aftermarket parts. Basically, every part on this vehicle here can be replaced with some kind of an aftermarket offering, be it in 3D print, cast resin, photo etch, cast metal, turned metal, you name it. there's going to be some kind of an aftermarket solution out there for your needs. As for what parts would be recommended, outside of the tracks, the remainder is really best up to the builder's discretion. But keep in mind, if you want to go down that route, this kit here would be a really good candidate to undertake with it. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Jagdpanzer IV command tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been published on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll see everyone again on the next one. Take care.